The Singapore summit exposed the flaws in American foreign policy that has overwhelmingly relied upon the naive assumption that the U.S. could narrowly negotiate North Korea's complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. CVID. In return for dismantling its nuclear program, the United States was prepared to aid the North's flagging economy and even ensure the protection and the survivability of the Kim regime. In so doing, the U.S. was willing to forfeit its basic values by ignoring the North's atrocious human rights record, as well as solidifying a two-state reality on the Korean Peninsula. Nevertheless, shortly after the summit, the North made several concessions, such as closing obsolete nuclear test site, release of imprisoned Americans, the return of American service members' remains, and the cessation of missile tests and other acts of provocation. These concessions were largely hailed in the West as great achievements in U.S. relations with the North. The Trump administration saw them as goodwill developed by the President and Kim, and continued to believe that negotiations would lead to denuclearization. Unfortunately, the sanctions regime that initially brought Kim Jong-un to heel had already begun to unravel. Before the U.S. DPRK summit, Xi Jinping, the Premier of China, invited Kim to a meeting in Beijing with full state honors. Ironically, the Singapore summit was the catalyst for mending grievances between China and North Korea. In addition, shortly after the U.S. DPRK bilateral talks, the Russian foreign minister made a trip to Pyongyang to personally meet with Kim Jong-un, further eroding the sanctions regime. What followed was an evolving policy of greater cooperation with the North. The Moon administration then focused on relaxation of sanctions, and then the declaration of the end of war between the two Koreas and the United States, to the chagrin of the US and Japan. On September 19th, in a speech in Rongrado Stadium, Moon stated that he and Kim Jong-un pledged to hasten the future of a common prosperity and reunification on our own terms. Moon broadened the theme of North-South cooperation to advocate for global sanctions relief on behalf of North Korea. During the UN General Assembly on September 26th, he stated, "Now is a time that the international community should give something in return for the new choice and efforts that North Korea has made." On October 19th, in a gathering with the heads of European nations, he called on them to relax sanctions on the North, even trying to set up meetings on behalf of Kim Jong-un and other world leaders like Pope Francis. The summit created an atmosphere of loosening sanctions and an unhealthy North-South cooperation that threatens the ROK, US, Japan alliance and its attempt to curtail the North's nuclear ambition. Over the years, it has learned how to manipulate its relationship with the ROK and the US to its benefit. Simply put, all it needs to do is drag out the talks to buy time and economic concessions while hoping for a change in domestic political fortune of its adversaries. The US should recognize its inability to execute on a narrowly defined endgame, especially when there is a moving goal line due to wishful thinking and poor planning. Given the current state of affairs, the US should abandon its narrow bilateral approach to denuclearization. Set aside the hubris and faulty assumptions that narrowly defined goals can somehow be accomplished. History has proven that this will never happen. There are always unexpected consequences. I believe the only viable option at this point is that US policy embraces the idea of unification as a necessary strategic approach to denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula.